So Kitt Carpenter, it's great to see you.
It's
Let's
great to
start,
see you.
let's start with who you are and what do you do?
Sure. Wow. That was exciting. Welcome. It's great to be here. I'm Kitt Carpenter. I am a professor at Vanderbilt. I'm an economist by training, but I'm really kind of a interdisciplinary social scientist. I consider myself first and foremost a policy researcher. I'm mostly interested in kind of how public policies towards different communities affect their behaviors, typically their health behaviors and their health outcomes. And increasingly, I am interested in LGBTQ people and how policies both focused on LGBTQ people, like same-sex marriage, like non-discrimination, affect LGBTQ people's outcomes, but also how policies that have were never intended to be about queer people, how those policies might either have differential effects on queer people or no effects depending on the specific policy in question.
Let me
So
mention two things. By the way, we know each other
yes.
from. I I take full credit for all your successes. I knew you when you were a postdoc.
That's right.
And what are some of your recent accolades that?
Oh, I don't know about accolades, but I have the very nice opportunity to be president-elect of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, which is where we physically just saw each other in DC. I think I'm the first openly queer president of APPAM in its history. I think even perhaps more shockingly, I might be the first Asian American president in APPAM's history, which is a surprise on many levels.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, APM is kind of the thing that I'm devoting a lot of time to right now. And then I get to build a lot of cool things at Vanderbilt in the LGBTQ space, which, doing that in the current moment at a place like Vanderbilt in a state like Tennessee, which has a very rough stance towards queer folks, is really an interesting challenge, but a really meaningful one too.
Yeah, I should say you're a member of the National Academy of Medicine, all kinds of.
As
If
of
if
like
I read
two
your
minutes
CV,
ago, yes.
if I read your CV, it would be we that would sort of suck up our entire time. There so maybe I'll just start with I want to get into the queer issues in particular, but what's your
Sure.
favorite paper and your most surprising result?
Oh gosh, I have many favorite papers. I will tell you the first paper that I wrote on LGBTQ folks, as economists, we're obsessed with earnings. And so, just running standard earnings regressions to see how different characteristics are independently associated with earnings. The first paper that I wrote caused quite a splash in part because it found that there was no earnings difference for especially gay men relative to similarly situated heterosexual men in the state of California using data from the California Health Interview Survey. The California was at the very leading edge of data sets that they asked about sexual orientation way back when, like 20 years ago when the data first started being rolled out. And all the previous work, including by my friend and now co-author Lee Badgett, had shown the most robust result across space, time, country, everything is that gay men earn way less, like way, way less than similarly situated heterosexual men. And we think that's probably because of discrimination. We think that might be lots of other things, like literally straight up animus against gay men, especially since most of the people setting wages are heterosexual men, and heterosexual men are kind of uniquely threatened by gay men, according to lots of other literature. So when I published my first paper showing actually there's no difference, there was quite a stir. So that was pretty surprising. You know, I actually think it's not actually that surprising because it was the state of California. And so we probably think that there are much more liberal attitudes, even way back when, towards queer folks in the state of California. And, one interpretation of the result, this was a super, one cross-section kind of result. So one interpretation of that result is well, it's actually because of very strong employment protection that California has had, very strong non-discrimination protection that California has had for a long, long time, that has kind of produced relatively benign outcomes, i.e., no significant difference, when in fact all of the other research had shown gigantic, some would say implausibly large earnings differentials on the
If,
order of 10, 20, 30%.
if I could cut in on that, one of the interesting things in the economic theory literature on discrimination is that small groups, if the issue is employer animus,
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of different sources of discrimination. If the issue is simply employer animus, that a small group in some ways is best positioned to find ways to work around that in terms of the economic inequality aspect, although not in terms of other things. And one of the interesting questions is, okay, one can have earnings, one can achieve parity in earnings and still be socially excluded in a lot of ways. If you look at the literature on, for instance, in Jews, the history of Jews, tremendous anti-Semitism, but because Jews are a pretty small group, that you could, so lots of law firms in New York City never hired Jews. And so if you want to be in the white shoe law firm in New York City, they didn't hire Jews. But the reality was that there were lots of Jewish lawyers who could do the job fine. And so there would be law firms that said, oh, there's all these Jewish lawyers available who maybe have slightly lower wages because they can't get into the, so we'll hire them, we'll do the work, and we'll be segregated. There's a Yiddishkeit firm,
right.
but we can charge the same rate as
That's interesting.
as the Christian firms because we're providing the same quality work. And one of the interesting things was the nature of the stereotypes was less economically harmful because people disliked Jews, but they did not believe that Jews were of lesser capacity. And one of the interesting issues was the distinction between that and, say, anti-Black racism,
Absolutely,
which is a much more profound and dehumanizing thing.
Sure.
That I remember when I was exposed to anti-Semitism as an undergraduate, I'm older than you are, the same people who would be really obnoxious to me when I was an undergraduate at Princeton would also ask me how to do problem 2 on the problem set. I remember one guy seriously insulted me. He said, the only reason why you're here is because you're smart. That was an insult. And what was interesting about it was that there was, it was not fun to have people, there was a social exclusion aspect, but it was also very different from, I do not believe you're capable of doing the work. Right. Or whatever. But anyway, so now if LGBTQ plus people were a larger group of people, then the animus, if you go back, it's harder to get around. So it's easier for a small group to find niches in the economy where there's just fair competition.
Yeah.
So please continue.
No, I just think that's a really interesting observation. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it does raise at least 2 other things that I think we've seen over and over, or learning more and more about, or thinking more and more about queer people in the economy. So one is that queer is a monolith, and there's a ton of interesting heterogeneity among that. So, for example, there's really interesting work on lesbians. So there's this, butch lesbians or femme lesbians, and so which of those groups does particularly bad or particularly not so bad in the labor market. In other labor markets, like in Europe, for example, where it's common to show a photo of yourself along with your resume, it provides all sorts of interesting avenues for understanding what happens if we have fictitious candidates, but one of the women has long flowy hair and one of the women has a short kind of butchy haircut, those types of things. And those results kind of go probably in the direction that you are thinking, but it does.
What is the direction? Where do they go?
So the studying gay men and lesbians is so tricky and interesting because the stylized fact about gay men, which I said before, which is that they do way worse, it goes in the opposite direction for women. So lesbians, the stylized fact is that lesbians do way better than similarly situated heterosexual women, both because they are less likely to select out of the labor market to have children, and employers expect that they might be more committed to their jobs. Lots of their actual experience might, the difference between their actual and potential experience might be different than for heterosexual women. So there's lots of kind of really interesting kind of heterogeneity across the different subgroups of queer people.
Just to make it explicit for students. So there's a human capital accumulation process, which may be more penalizing for cisgender heterosexual women who leave the workforce.
That's correct.
Childbearing, or who may be expected to do that.
Right.
That at least in people's conceptions of the life cycle of lesbian workers may be different, and that could lead lesbian women to have a more favorable earnings profile than apparently similarly situated cisgender heterosexual women.
That's right. And as to the specific direction that those results go, there are so many studies now that I want to be a little bit careful. So I can direct you to the specific studies to know which you can consult the specific ones. So Marina Gorsuch has a great paper in Industrial Labor Relations Review, because there's some kind of complicated thing about like being in line with people's expectations versus violating social norms. So, femme lesbians in some way like violate the expectation that like lesbians are just kind of like masculine women in some sense in the eyes of, people who haven't interacted with lesbians that much. So let me not quote specifically the direction in which the butch femme thing goes, but for sure the lesbians almost always do better than the similarly situated heterosexual women. The other point that your comment made me think to say is like, the economist's obsession with earnings and employment is very limiting. And so what we are learning from other disciplines and also just from living in the world is that like we don't do economists do well at things that we measure well, but like other things that we don't measure as well, like, I don't know, microaggressions or like how happy you are at work or like, the match between your work and your life balance and that kind of thing. Like we know much less about those things as economists. And I think other disciplines are doing a better job through other ways of inquiry to know kind of this multifaceted, multidimensional aspects of well-being for queer people in regards to their work.
That's a really important point. And even if wages equilibrate,
yeah,
that does not, that's important, but that's
yep, exactly.
there's a lot
Necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what do you think of as the key economic challenges that are facing the LGBTQ plus community right now?
Oh, gosh. So that's a really hard question in the context of what just happened in Colorado 24 hours ago. And, I'm not exactly sure when you're showing this, but, the Q nightclub shooting, which, may or may not be bias motivated, but certainly starts to look that way, given what we know now. And again, it's only been 24 hours or so. And I raise that in the context of, that is very much related to people's sense of safety at work and happiness with kind of their ability to live free and open lives. So much of economic challenges has to do with just like social acceptance and belonging and overall kind of non-economic factors of well-being, which we know spill over into kind of your ability to live, be your true self at work and to kind of, be a productive member of your team. And, a mantra that we always hear people talk about is like, it's in no one's, if you're a profit maximizing employer, you should want your workers to be full, healthy, open, about all aspects of their lives, because it takes mental energy to like, be careful about what you say about who you spent time with over the weekend, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me complicate that a little bit,
Yeah.
though. That is true if you assume that employees are collaborating with each other. And that, one of the challenges that we've had in not just LGBTQ plus issues, but many other issues is when there's coworker discrimination, stigmatization, and conflict. You could imagine that a lot of employers might discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, not because they themselves would admit to any animus, but because they say, it's going to create conflict in my workplace, and I have a very homophobic workforce. That's just the reality. I have a factory and a lot of our workers are homophobic, and I can't deal with that. And one of the things that I will provide for students, there's an amazing interview that was done. David Halberstam has a wonderful book about the 50s where he interviews William Levitt, who did who created Levittown. And one of the things that Levitt talks about, and I must say I had such an acute sense of moral injury listening to this interview. He's a Jewish man. He's basically talking about why they discriminate against Black people in Levittown. They did not allow Black people. And he basically said, if I allow Black people to buy homes here, that I won't get any white people buying homes here. And like, I personally feel no discrimination. And so, I'm listening to and I'm reading this.
Yeah.
And it is such an amoral perspective, but one where you could see he's responding to a market signal where he's basically saying, if my customers have highly discriminatory preferences or my workforce has highly discriminatory preferences, it's easier for me to just cater to that. And since like LGBTQ plus people are a small percentage of the population, if I discriminate against them or allow that to happen, financially, that could be a better thing for me than to actually stand up for these values.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I found so offensive was he seemed to take credit for the fact that he did not hold these discriminatory preferences. He was just enforcing them.
Yeah.
You know?
That's a really interesting point and story, and I think it raises something that like is very much related to a direct answer to your question about a key challenge facing queer people with respect to economic and employment opportunities. So that behavior that you just described, while very interesting, is still discrimination, and in a
Yes.
world like today, it's also explicitly illegal. So one thing that I think is an especial challenge is that like people either don't know or don't believe, queer people either don't know or don't believe that that they have employment protection in the eyes of the government, and now the federal government. So what happened in summer 2021 or summer 2020 is the Bostock versus Clayton County decision, which this is the Neil Gorsuch Supreme Court case because of sex, right? Are the gay and the trans people, set aside bisexual people for a moment, which is actually quite unclear in the Supreme Court decision where bisexual people fit. What this ruling said is that, so Bostock played on a gay softball team and had a Facebook profile and were like that illustrated that he was on that team, and his employer found out about it and fired him in a state of Georgia where there was not state level protection on the basis, employment protection on the basis of sexual orientation. And so, as was true in 24 states prior to the Supreme Court ruling. So what happened in the Supreme Court ruling, a very surprising one for queer progressive advocates, was the federal government said for the first time that sexual orientation and gender identity are covered as protected characteristics under federal sex discrimination statutes. So what that means is that like any queer person, regardless of where you live in the United States, if you are experiencing that type of discrimination, you have legal recourse. Now, I don't mean to imply that it's not, that it's like super easy, like you have to get a lawyer, you have to file something with the EEOC, etc. But for a large set of folks in states that are have quite a bit of animus towards queer people, like that is a legal avenue that we did not have before. And I think that, you know, letting people know about that. So we've done studies where like there is no different, like a third of queer people do not know that they have federal employment protection on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity.
By the way, I
We
think
could just let people know, like information helps in that respect, but go ahead.
another thing is that also creates a deterrent, because
Exactly.
if I'm a department store in Athens, Georgia, um, you know,
Yeah,
I now I'm on notice
exactly.
that if I try to do this, that but I think the idea that that just because workers are equally productive, that the idea that markets will eradicate discrimination, that is that is not right. That there are mechanisms within the workplace
Mm-hmm.
that if discriminatory preferences are prevalent throughout the society, those can make themselves felt in markets in ways where the
Absolutely.
market will cater to those discriminatory preferences, not counteract them. Now, I mean, now I must say there's one difference between LGBTQ plus and say anti-Black discrimination, which is that the intergenerational issues are different. That you don't have people growing up in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago where they have been in a segregated environment with substandard schools.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is sort of the intersectionality issue, though, that I think many of us have a stereotypical image of, say, who a gay man is. That is often
Yeah,
a middle class white person.
right. Lee Badgett has this amazing book, many amazing books, but she has this book about, you know, basically the myth of gay affluence. So we think of gay people as dinks, dual income, no kids, right? They're out there with this enormous amount of disposable income. Like there was all this evidence that, like, you know, people would go to marketers and be like, market to the queers because there's all this disposable income running around and they have no, anyway. And we're increasingly learning through credible population representative demographic data sets that that's like totally not true. So lots of queer people have kids, especially queer women, especially queer folks of color. Lots of people like don't use the terms that like many of the rest of us use to describe themselves as queer, despite that like they are in same-sex relationships, for example, or they have same-sex sex. And that is increasingly in these intersections of Black and brown queer folks, or people that I would call queer folks, lower income queer folks. Yes, so I will say though that like as an academy, we are doing a fairly horrible job of like credibly um understanding the what works and what doesn't work for people at the intersections of these marginalized backgrounds, in part because of data. And we always say, oh, it's a small sample to begin with, and then you cut it even smaller. But that's a really horrible answer. I mean, we all know the statistics about murder and domestic violence rates of Black trans women, et cetera. So I think that's going to be increasingly a poor answer, in part because also, if you've looked at the statistics lately, the fastest growing demographic within the queer population is like trans and non-binary folks and youths in particular. So like very increasingly strong shares of kids, of young people, are describing themselves as non-binary.
By the way, it was astonishing. We did some studies in Chicago of services for cisgender girls.
Mm-hmm.
And we asked people how they identified in their sexual and gender identities. And the proportion of young women who identified themselves as something other than exclusively heterosexual was
Mm-hmm.
enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And much higher than I expected. And I mean, it was really striking. By the way, there's this class issue, which I think also reflects just the bias of our own positionality. Like if you say, who is it, if you're a professor at the University of Chicago or Vanderbilt, who are the LGBTQ plus people that if you are a cisgender heterosexual man, it's your class peers, and
Yeah.
there's a whole set of, and that's just such a straight from the journal of selection bias.
Yep.
But Randy Schultz has this wonderful book, Conduct Unbecoming, about the military. And it's an amazing book about the don't ask, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's striking, I remember I saw him. He's long since passed away, unfortunately, from HIV. But I saw him give a couple of presentations when I was a graduate student, and there were a couple of things that were striking about that book. One was that the Navy actually was disciplining ship captains because ship captains valued the lesbian crew members as being more effective. And so people were literally disciplined. They were said, you are covering up for these lesbian crew members simply because they're good at their jobs. And so you are not enforcing, our rules against that.
Mm-hmm.
But the second thing was that in the popular mind, a lot of people thought that stuff like don't ask, don't tell is not important because gay people, how many gay people want to join the military or whatever? Right. And the idea that, if I'm a mechanic in Louisiana and I'm a gay man, the military, first of all, it's an important career path. And secondly, I might want to get out of town.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right.
And that actually there's a group of people for whom this was actually quite important in a very practical way. And that a lot of people, including a lot of queer people in Schultz's time, did not appreciate that this is actually closing off something that was really important to people.
It's very interesting, yeah.
And that this sort of, this sort of dink stereotype,
yep,
really became such a blinder about, there's people, gay people are in every segment of the economy, every social class, and there's a guy who loves to fix cars and who's also a gay man, and he wants to be in the army and working, doing work in the army.
Right.
And it wasn't just a symbolic issue. Everybody understood the symbolic importance of it, but that no, this was actually also, a great practical importance. So by the way, if I gave you, I want to be respectful of your time.
Sure.
In the last 3 minutes, I should say you've also done a lot of important work on youth substance use, a lot of other stuff we could go on.
Yeah, sure.
If I gave you, so you have a center that studies.
Yes.
What's the name of it?
It's the Vanderbilt LGBTQ plus policy lab. Please Google us. We're hiring postdocs all the time. Anybody wants to come work with us, we'd love to talk with you more.
So if I gave you $15 million to study whatever you thought was the critical policy priority or research priority that's relevant to your center, how would you spend the money? I should tell you, I do not have.
That's like such a specific amount of money. It really makes me think that you have that in hand. I mean, okay, so I'll say something, I'll say a couple of things. One is like something quasi-controversial, which is I actually still think we need to know a lot more about same-sex marriage. So I have somebody who, the reason it's quasi-controversial is because like there has been so much Sturm und Drang in the movement about like, did were we so wedded to same-sex marriage? We've left so many communities behind within the queer community. Like we gave up everything for marriage, et cetera, et cetera. I will tell you that like we know so little about the fundamental change to the social institution that was legal access to same-sex marriage. And now I write grant proposals and papers all the time where reviewers constantly say things, and I'm in conversations where people constantly say things like same-sex marriage is not going anywhere. This is like pointless to keep studying this. And I just pick up my jaw off the ground and be like, did you not just live through Dobbs? Did you not read the concurring opinion in Dobbs, which literally says, let us reevaluate not only Obergefell, which was legal nationwide access to same-sex marriage. And I get that, yes, last week there was a 62-38 vote overcoming procedural. I get all of that is true. But like literally in that same pen stroke where Justice Thomas is saying, let's reconsider Obergefell, Justice Thomas is saying, let's reconsider Lawrence versus Texas. Lawrence versus Texas literally just says that consensual same-sex sex is not illegal. So we're talking about, you know, in a world where Dobbs just overturned Roe, I think it naive for us to pretend that like we're not in a world where like, yes, marriage, but like, you know, things that I think people would consider much more fundamental basic rights for queer people, which is like, can you just sleep with who you want to sleep with and not be concerned that will, you know what I mean? Like that, we are in that world where somebody uttered the quiet part out loud. And so I am always now kind of like shocked that people are shocked, you know, shocked that people are like, oh, that's not going anywhere. So I would study those things because I think that sooner rather than later, we're going to have a re-emergence at the Supreme Court and at other court levels about like, well, did Supreme Court or did legal same-sex marriage do anything good or bad to anyone? And I know of, and again, economists think about this differently than other fields, but like I know of maybe 3, maybe 4 credible studies that have looked at the causal effects of legal same-sex marriage using data and methods that like some of us were trained to think about. And I wrote like 2 of them. So we need other people, and that came out wrong, but like we need lots of more people besides me and in addition to me to be studying kind of the change in how legal access to same-sex marriage affected people's health, economic well-being, hate crime, you know, all manner of things.
It's such a, by the way, I share your sense that this in the short term, particularly that the range of plausible outcomes is greater than people think. I mean, who would have thought that President Trump would be president of the United States?
Right, exactly.
You know, that, I mean, I must say, if the Supreme Court actually revisited those things, I think that the American public, particularly young people, there would be such a backlash to it that, I mean, one of the striking things when I talk to young people is just people, you know, it's like, you know, when most people under 30, they're like, let me get this straight. People are really worked up about who uses what bathroom, you know, like that. There has been such a shift in social norms that I remember some of the conservative Republican primary candidates went to very conservative Christian colleges. And when they would say things that were anti-LGBTQ plus, the young people who were quite conservative, pro-life, they weren't buying. You know, and everybody in their own lives, you know, and I don't know exactly what would happen, but I think that there would be a legitimation crisis. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to say 2 more quick things just so that I'm on record about those things. So one is that like we need a much more fundamental understanding of why the change in public opinion on same-sex marriage rights was so fast, so swift, so broad-based, and so different than the shift on, say, you know, feelings towards Black folks. Like we don't understand why the speed of those shifts was so different. And then the second thing is I totally agree with the people who say same-sex marriage attention is undue, in part because like in the world we live in now, the trans folks have just been like, so now are the boogie person. So the bathroom stuff, but also just the sports stuff. And also we know precious little about the effects of any of those policies, but also like just the political science about why do those things have such purchase now. And it's clear, I think, from the midterms that they do have quite a bit of purchase across lots of different parts of the country. And we need a lot more. We do actually need a lot more political science and other fields understanding kind of what causes this variation to emerge across places. And that's outside my wheelhouse. I wish more people were studying that.
But what's interesting is, I mean, it is, if you say, why is anti-Black racism and anti-LGBTQ plus animus? How have those
Mhm.
played out differently? It is such an interesting contrast, although granular, as you point out. So
Mhm.
one is that there's a structural component to anti-Black racism that is different. Not that there isn't a structural component to
Mhm. Mhm.
LGBTQ plus, but it's different. And there's also a sense in which, you know, like who has sex with what other person? There is a sense that like why, like that really has no, it's not obvious why Harold Pollack is affected one way or the other by that. My
Uh-huh.
material interests are not directly implicated. Now, one of the interesting things about the trans issue is people say, well, wait a minute, you know, if my daughter's a swimmer,
Yep. Right.
that can be conceptualized
Mhm.
as now she has to swim against a 6'2" trans woman.
Mhm.
And so there is this sense of competitive
Mhm.
something. But there is this direct sense where your treasure, your heart is. And with anti-Black racism, it's really a question of are we willing as a society to acknowledge that there are very concrete harms that require significant economic resources
Right.
to be addressed, as opposed to with the LGBTQ plus issue, it's much more often, can we just not discriminate and be basically unaffected, except that I might have to see those two guys walking down the street holding
That's right.
hands, and
That's right.
I'm socialized to be uncomfortable with that,
Yeah.
um,
That's a very good point. Yeah, yeah. I agree.
and it is, I mean, I do think that those are, um,
Yep.
that there's a big difference
I
there.
agree.
The it is because I mean, it's just a fundamental, and I think from a young person's perspective, there's a kind of fundamental stupidity to anti-LGBTQ plus policies very often that becomes, when you start to see there is no economic rationale, or there's no benefit to myself to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people. And so, why, it becomes, so in some sense, it's just an easy, it fits within our libertarian worldview, in a more profound way. The, um, well, anyway, it's so wonderful to talk to you, and
Yeah, same here.
congratulations
Thank you.
on your many accomplishments,
Thank you. Thank you.
from now and to come. And um, and it's it's just I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm gonna stop the recording now. Anything I should say before I stop the recording?
No, no, no. Just thanks. It's been fun.